By the spring of 1945, the collapsing Third Reich still held a scattering of technologies that no other nation on Earth could fully replicate. Liquid-fueled rockets capable of reaching the edge of space. The world's first operational jet fighters. Nerve agents so advanced that Allied chemists, when they finally found them, assumed for weeks that German scientists must have made a mistake, because nothing like this was supposed to exist yet. And buried in that pile of captured hardware and terrified engineers was a quiet, almost absurd irony. Some of the same men who had built weapons meant to bomb London and Antwerp would, within a generation, help put human beings on the surface of the moon. How does a program built to serve the worst regime of the 20th century end up laying the groundwork for a triumph the whole world would celebrate? That question is where this story actually begins. To understand what happened to Germany's secret weapons after 1945, you first have to understand how far ahead of everyone else Germany actually was. At Peenemünde, a remote research station on the Baltic coast, engineers under Wernher von Braun had spent the war years developing the A-4 rocket, better known by its propaganda name, the V-2. It was the first man-made object to reach the edge of space, and by the war's end, Germany had launched roughly 3,000 of them at targets in England, Belgium, and France, killing an estimated 9,000 civilians, with several thousand more forced laborers dying in the underground factories that built the weapon in the first place. Alongside the V-2 sat the Messerschmitt Me 262, the first jet fighter to see combat, faster by more than 100 miles an hour than anything the Allies could put in the air. German chemists at IG Farben had also developed tabun and sarin, nerve agents so lethal that a few milligrams absorbed through the skin could kill an adult within minutes. And Germany had stockpiled an estimated 12,000 tons of tabun at a single production site near Dierenfurth in Silesia. None of these weapons had turned the tide of the war. Germany's industrial base was already broken by early 1945, its fuel refineries bombed into ruin, and its rail network too damaged to move finished rockets in useful numbers. But every advancing army converging on the collapsing Reich understood something the public did not yet grasp. Whoever controlled this technology, and the minds behind it, would hold a decisive advantage in whatever conflict came next. Roosevelt had died in April. Churchill would lose his premiership within weeks of the German surrender, and Stalin was already positioning Soviet forces to seize as much of Central Europe as circumstances allowed. Against that backdrop, for separate occupying powers, American, British, French, and Soviet, found themselves racing across a shattered country with roughly the same shopping list. The problem was never simply capturing hardware. Rockets could be crated and shipped west by rail, given enough locomotives and a few weeks of lead time. Chemical stockpiles could be inventoried, sealed in drums, and seized under armed guard. The real prize, and the real danger, was the several thousand scientists, engineers, and technicians who actually understood how to build the next generation of these weapons. Blueprints alone were nearly worthless without someone who could explain why a particular alloy failed at altitude, or how a nerve agent's molecular structure had been arrived at in the first place. Every occupying power wanted that knowledge before a rival power got it, and in the closing weeks of the war, that competition would shape the fate of thousands of individual lives. The Americans moved first, and they moved with striking speed. As Soviet forces closed in on Peenemünde from the east, in early 1945, von Braun made a calculated decision. Rather than wait to be captured, or worse, executed on Hitler's standing order that the rocket team never fall into enemy hands, he organized roughly 500 of his senior staff and quietly relocated them southward into Bavaria, carrying with them the complete technical archive of the V-2 program hidden in a mineshaft near the town of Dornton. On May 2, 1945, von Braun's younger brother Magnus approached an American private near the town of Ried in Austria on a bicycle, delivering the surrender of the entire team in English. American intelligence officers barely believed their luck. Within weeks, the operation that would become known as Operation Paperclip was underway, an initiative that eventually brought more than 1,600 German scientists and their families to the United States, roughly triple the number the Soviets would later relocate in a single night from the Eastern Zone. The screening process was supposed to exclude committed Nazis and war criminals, and on paper it relied on background checks conducted by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency in Washington. In practice, those checks were repeatedly overridden. Officers in the field, eager to secure talent before French or Soviet recruiters could make a competing offer, frequently rewrote or simply deleted unfavorable sections of a scientist's file before it reached Washington for final approval. Several men with documented ties to slave labor programs at the underground metalwork factory near Nordhausen, where thousands of prisoners died constructing V2 components inside a mountain, were quietly cleared for entry anyway, their paperwork sanitized well before they ever boarded a ship for New York. We'll get to how that particular contradiction played out later in this video, because it matters more than most people realize. First, subscribe to the channel if you want more deep dives into the technology and human cost behind the Second World War's most consequential secrets, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. The Soviets were not far behind, and where the Americans preferred persuasion, Moscow preferred coercion. Soviet forces had reached Piedmont only to find it largely stripped of both hardware and personnel, so their intelligence services turned instead to what remained: the V2 production facilities further south, and the engineers who had stayed behind, either because they had not fled with von Braun or because they saw no advantage in doing so. Through 1945 and into 1946, Soviet officials courted these remaining specialists with relatively generous terms, decent pay, housing, and the promise of continued research work inside the Soviet occupation zone. That courtship ended abruptly on the night of October 22, 1946, when Soviet troops moved simultaneously through dozens of towns in East Germany and forcibly loaded more than 2,000 scientists and technicians, along with an estimated 6,000 family members, onto trains bound for the Soviet Union. The operation, codenamed Osoaviakim, gave the affected families only hours of notice, arriving before dawn with trucks and instructions to pack only what could be carried immediately. Most were resettled around Moscow and on Gorodomlya Island in Lake Seliger, a small research colony ringed by guards where scientists continued rocket work under close supervision for years, permitted to ride home but never to leave. Unlike von Braun's team in the United States, these specialists were kept deliberately separate from the Soviet Union's own leading rocket designer, Sergei Korolev, himself a former prisoner in Stalin's Gulag system, because Soviet officials distrusted foreign nationals working too closely alongside their most valuable domestic talent. The German engineers nonetheless contributed directly to the Soviet R-1 and R-2 missiles, near copies and modest improvements on the original V-2 design, which by the mid-1950s had matured under Korolev's own direction into the R-7, the rocket family that would eventually carry Sputnik into orbit in October 1957 and Yuri Gagarin into space in April 1961. Most of the relocated Germans were permitted to return home only in the mid-1950s, roughly a decade after their trains had first left East Germany, long after their technical contributions had already been absorbed and their usefulness, in the eyes of Soviet planners, had quietly expired. The chemical weapons followed a quieter but equally consequential path. When British and American chemical warfare units first analyzed captured stocks of tabun and sarin in 1945, they were, by several accounts, deeply unsettled to discover Germany had developed nerve agent technology roughly a decade ahead of anything in Allied laboratories. Rather than destroy this knowledge, both Western and Soviet militaries absorbed it. British researchers used captured German data and personnel to accelerate their own nerve agent program at Portendown, while American forces shipped documentation and equipment back for study at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Some captured tabun stockpiles were later dumped at sea, a disposal method that decades afterward would trouble environmental regulators monitoring corroding munitions on the floor of the Baltic. The scientific director behind the German program, Gerhard Schrader, had actually stumbled onto tabun's lethal properties in 1936 while researching insecticides at IG Farben, only for German military chemists to recognize its potential as a weapon and classify the discovery immediately. Schrader was never prosecuted after the war and returned to civilian chemical research, spending his later career developing agricultural pesticides, a quiet ending that stands in contrast to the far more publicly documented fates of the rocket engineers, and one that underscores how thin the line could be between a chemist's laboratory accident and a nation's chemical arsenal. Nuclear research took its own separate and, in hindsight, almost farcical trajectory. Germany's wartime atomic program, led loosely by physicist Werner Heisenberg, had never come close to producing a workable weapon, hampered by resource shortages, internal rivalries, and, historians still debate, possibly by Heisenberg's own miscalculations about the amount of uranium needed to sustain a chain reaction. Even so, a dedicated Anglo-American intelligence mission called Alsos moved through Germany specifically to locate German nuclear scientists before Soviet forces could reach them. 10 of the program's key figures, including Heisenberg and Otto Hahn, the chemist who had discovered nuclear fission in 1938, were captured and interned at Farm Hall, a bug country house in England, where their private conversations were secretly recorded for 6 months. Those recordings captured Hahn and his colleagues' learning of the Hiroshima bombing on the evening of August 6, 1945, and the transcripts reveal a group of scientists genuinely stunned that the Allies had built a functioning weapon while their own effort had stalled years earlier. Heisenberg initially told his colleagues he doubted the announcement was accurate, guessing aloud that the bomb might only be a large conventional device dressed up for propaganda purposes, a misjudgment he corrected within hours once the technical details of the announcement sank in. All 10 scientists were eventually released and returned to Germany in January 1946, most resuming ordinary academic careers, a far gentler outcome than the forced relocations then being finalized for their counterparts working on guided weapons. What makes this story more than a simple tally of scientists relocated and hardware seized is the direction these individual threads eventually bent. The most striking of these reversals belongs to von Braun himself, the man who had once accepted an SS officer's rank, and who by his own later account knew of the brutal conditions inside the Mittelwerk Tunnel factory, where an estimated 20,000 forced laborers died from exhaustion, disease, and execution, was resettled by the American government first to Fort Bliss in Texas, then to Huntsville, Alabama, where he became the technical director of the U.S. Army's ballistic missile program. By 1960, his team had been folded into the newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and by 1969 the rocket he designed, the Saturn V, carried Apollo 11 to the moon in front of a global television audience estimated at roughly 600 million people. The same engineering lineage that had once rained warheads on London now delivered Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin safely across nearly 240,000 miles of empty space. Von Braun spent the rest of his public life largely unquestioned about his wartime past, appearing in Disney television specials in the 1950s to popularize spaceflight for American audiences who had no idea that the same charming engineer had once worn an SS uniform and toured the Mittelwerk tunnels while prisoners worked and died within earshot of his inspections. That silence, historians now argue, was less an oversight than a deliberate choice by an American government eager to win the space race and unwilling to look too closely at how it had acquired the talent to do so. It would take until the early 1980s, decades after Apollo 11, for journalists and prosecutors to seriously re-examine what von Braun's own engineers had known and done inside that mountain. The irony cuts the other direction as well. Arthur Rudolph, one of von Braun's closest collaborators and the operations director who had overseen production inside the Mittelwerk tunnels, spent decades as a celebrated NASA engineer, even receiving the agency's Distinguished Service Medal, before U.S. Justice Department investigators in 1984 confronted him with evidence of his direct role in the deaths of forced laborers. Rather than face a public trial, Rudolph agreed in 1984 to renounce his American citizenship and leave for West Germany voluntarily, an arrangement negotiated privately between his lawyers and federal prosecutors that avoided the spectacle of a courtroom entirely. It closed out one of the more uncomfortable chapters in the entire Paperclip program, arriving roughly 4 decades after the war had ended and long after Rudolph had already collected a government pension for his contributions to the American space program. It was a resolution that satisfied almost no one. Too quiet for the survivors and their families who had waited a lifetime for accountability, too late to undo the honors already awarded, and too small a gesture set against the scale of what had happened beneath the Konstein Mountain, where the V-2s were built. The longer arc of this story stretches well beyond the individual fates of von Braun, Rudolph, or Heisenberg. Every major spacefaring and missile program of the Cold War owed something to the scattering of German talent in 1945. American intercontinental ballistic missiles, Soviet orbital rockets, even portions of early French and British rocketry programs traced their engineering lineage back through Piedmont. France, notably, recruited its own smaller contingent of roughly 100 German rocket specialists immediately after the war, folding their expertise into a nascent national space program that would eventually produce the Ariane launch family decades later. The nerve agents developed under Schrader's direction became the technical starting point for Cold War chemical weapons stockpiles held by multiple nations for decades afterward, arsenals that international treaties would spend the following half-century trying to dismantle. And the farm-hall recordings, kept classified until 1992, gave later generations of historians a rare, unfiltered window into how a nation's top scientists reckoned with their own failure and their adversary's success in the same conversation. Behind every one of these outcomes were people making impossible choices under extraordinary pressure. Some, like von Braun, chose ambition over conscience and rarely spoke publicly about the cost. Others, like the anonymous German technicians rounded up in the middle of the night during Operation Osoaviakim, had almost no choice at all, uprooted from their homes and families to build weapons for a government that had been their enemy only months before. Many never returned to Germany. Some died in Soviet research facilities far from home, their contributions to Cold War missile programs never publicly credited under their own names. Still others, ordinary laborers with no scientific standing whatsoever, left no trace in any surrendered archive, only numbers in Middleworks' grim production ledgers. Historians estimate that roughly 60,000 prisoners passed through the Mittelbau-Dora camp system that fed forced labor into the V-2 program, and that at least 20,000 of them died there, a toll higher than the number of civilians killed by the finished rockets themselves. Their suffering is easy to forget when the story gets told through the achievements of famous engineers standing beside gleaming rockets on launch pads. War does not simply end with a surrender document. It scatters people, knowledge, and guilt across decades. It rewards some men with medals and quietly erases others from the record entirely, and the consequences of who gets captured, recruited, or forgotten can echo for generations. So when we look up at a rocket launch today, or read about international treaties banning chemical weapons, we are looking, whether we realize it or not, at the long shadow of a defeated regime's laboratories. The technology outlived the ideology that built it, carried forward by men who mostly escaped judgment for what they had helped make possible. That is the twist buried inside this story from the very first minute. The empire collapsed, but its weapons builders simply changed uniforms and kept working without much interruption at all, and one of them ended up standing beside a launch tower on the Florida coast, watching his own rocket carry 3 astronauts toward the surface of the moon. The empire itself vanished within weeks of these men's surrender. Its weapons and the knowledge behind them simply changed hands and kept moving forward under new flags. If you want to understand the parallel story of the Soviet side of this race in fuller detail, including what daily life actually looked like for the German engineers confined for a decade on the shores of a remote Russian lake, that's a story worth its own deep dive. Subscribe, ring the bell, and I'll see you in the next one.